You are lovable, you're already full. You are held in loving arms that lift you higher. You are able, forever grateful. You are filled with golden light, keep shining brighter. The world is more than it seems. Our lives are such precious gifts. Our minds are beautiful things. As we imagine, so it exists. We are lovable, we're already full. We are held in loving arms that lift us higher. We are able, forever grateful. We are filled with golden light, keep shining brighter. We are everything, we're joy and laughter. We were meant to fly, keep soaring higher.
Well, you know, every week I've been pulling a card out of this glass jar, and on those cards, you all back in August, maybe since then, but a lot of them August when we first started meeting here, answered the question about what you want Soul Center to be in your life and for others, and how you want to bless this space. And today I have a card I want to share with you from a Soul Center. What do you call us? A Soul Center groupie? A Soul Center groupie who lives in Georgia. And some of you know her. Her name is Jody Marshall. You know Jody Marshall? Jody Marshall is, I don't know, is she 95?
Yeah.
She's 95-ish.
Yeah.
And I met, is she? Yeah.
I'm not sure. I know she wants to live to be 100.
She has, her goal is to live to 100, and she's 95, and so she sends me money every month for Soul Center. Jody, she writes a check and she sends money to Soul Center. She listens to our service on her phone, and her hearing isn't very good right now, and so she really struggles to hear. And so she shares these things with me. Look, she writes me a card. She just doesn't send me a check. She writes me a card. And so yesterday I got this one in the mail, and I was reading it, and as I read the last paragraph, I was reading it to Renee, and I just started crying because I can't believe Jody and what Soul Center means to her and what she means to me. She says this. She talks about her, she says, oh, she had a tough time improving her hearing so she could hear this, but she's grateful for the help from her granddaughters to make that happen. And in the last paragraph, she says this. Watching Spiritual Soul Center on my cell and computer, she's 95. I don't think I watch anything on my cell. Watching Spiritual Soul Center on my cell and computer gives me a clearer understanding of your messages that are inspiring and open my mind to do a little better. Did I mention she's 95? And she's still, able. That was the name of my last message. Remember that? Do a little better? Like her mind is there. And she writes me this letter. And Paul, this is for you. Where's Paul Satan? She said, and it was delightful to see Paul and you when Paul read his card not so long ago. Love and blessings to you and Renee and to everybody at Spiritual Soul Center. So, the love that we have and the vibration that we are reaches beyond this room, reaches beyond our community, and reaches to my friend and our dear friend Jody Marshall in Canton, Georgia. And Jody, if you can hear me, I want you to know that we love you and we feel your love as well. And so thank you. This weekend is Memorial Day weekend, and it's a time when we pause to remember the men and women in our armed services who chose to defend our country and in that process lost their life. What a brave thing that so many men and women have done over the years to decide that our freedoms are so important that they're willing to put their lives on the line in many different ways. And so today we remember them and we feel the gratefulness in our heart for the service that they performed in the giving of their life. So let's pray together. Let's take a deep breath in and feel for a moment the gratitude we have in our hearts for those brave men and women who have served our country to defend our freedoms so that we are able to walk and talk without fear of retribution. Now be it known that there is still a ways to go, but that did not deter these men and women. They said, "Here I am. I'm the one. I want to be on the front line. And I am proud to serve my fellow Americans in this way." So for your sacrifice to your country, for your sacrifice to your families, our hearts are filled with gratitude. And they also are filled with hope that freedoms will truly ring, not just in the United States, but in the world. For that, we are hopeful. For you, each of you, we are grateful. And so it is. Amen.
I am ready to open up my head and let the love flow free from my chest. I've been used to the dark so long, my friend, in a dance with shadows I thought would never end. I tasted her perfume, she kissed up my sweat in a life half asleep, a life of regret. But now I'm ready to let those old stories go. Yeah, it's high time to step into something more. Yeah, I am ready to receive the gifts of the day. No more hiding my soul's light away. 'Cause what I've been waiting for has been waiting for me.
And so I'm happy to introduce to you our guest speaker today, who is Deb Bowen. And she wrote a book recently about grief. And I thought, well, what a great topic that is. Was it not recently?
No.
Okay.
We'll talk about that.
She'll talk about that. Just the facts, ma'am. But there's a book about grief, and I thought, well, who of us have not experienced grief? You know, here's what I'd like to start off with. And what Deb says, grief often accompanies the loss of a pet, the loss of a friendship, divorce, financial setbacks, the loss of a counselor, or the loss of a beloved home, and in many more ways. You know, any form of loss can precipitate grief in us, right? It's that sense of loss. Deb is a former grief counselor and a retired faculty from UNCW School of Social Work, and she's the author of A Good Friend for Bad Times, Helping Others Through Grief. So I believe you are in for quite a treat. I'd love for you to welcome Deb Bowen.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Wow, thank you all so very much for being here. I'm honored. So I meant to wear red today, but I don't have any red. But I wanted to wear red today because today is Pentecost. And in the Christian tradition, Pentecost was that day. Y'all, I'm still messing with this thing, I'm sorry. Pentecost was the day where Jesus' followers had gathered 50 days after the resurrection to grieve, to try to figure out what in the world had happened in their world. This man died, he came back, he spent some time with them, he went away, poof, I mean all this stuff, and they were just stunned. But he had promised them that on some day there would come down to them some kind of hope. And that hope came, according to the New Testament, in the form of the Holy Spirit. One of the words for Holy Spirit in that context is a Hebrew word that's rush. And it means wind, and it means the divine feminine. Just throw that at you. Just think about it. And so it occurred to me that grief is a really good topic to talk about in light of the notion of Pentecost and hope. So that's where I'm going to begin today, if I can see my notes and all that stuff. So let me tell you a story. My daddy died in 1998, and my mama died in 2000. And when mama died, a fairly new friend came, like folks do before the funeral, and she brought a cake in a box from a grocery store. My sister and I thanked her for her kindness, and then the cake sat unopened on the kitchen counter until our friends who were managing the kitchen and all that stuff that folks do threw it in the trash. So I tell you this because I was really grateful that the woman brought a cake. How very thoughtful, how very kind. And her gesture was certainly appreciated. But no one in my mama's southern culture would have dared cut a piece of cake from that cake. It didn't happen. And as my friend Terry Lynn said, what is a funeral without fried chicken? And she didn't mean Bojangles. So I tell you this story because it speaks to the importance of knowing a grieving person's culture, their beliefs and their customs. And having that information makes us better friends to our friends who are grieving. So the book that I wrote, by the way, which was in 2005, but it's still selling. We'll talk about that later. The book that I wrote really started out as a very long thank you note to all the wonderful people, hundreds of people, who so honored my family's culture and tradition, and who were so very kind to us. And that note morphed into the book that led me down a rabbit hole of exploring how various cultures and spiritual communities and differing models of grief theory all come together into some way of conceptualizing how we grieve or not in our lives. So I tell you that story about my mom and the cake because it speaks to my family's culture. Mom always took deviled eggs when people died. That was what she said was important. I don't know, but Mama believed that. And so she did say, though, that food helps people grieve. And I believe she's right about that. There's a binding that happens with food that's, I can't explain. My parents dying was really hard, as you can probably tell from how I started this talk. I loved them, still love them, and I still miss them. But they were ready to go. They told me very clearly what they did or did not want done as they were preparing to die and what to do after they died. And even so, their death was very hard. But not nearly as hard as the death of my 18-year-old Merlin the Magic Cat. I wasn't sure he was ready to go, and he couldn't tell me. I could only hope that the communication process that he and I had developed in those 18 years held true, and that I was understanding the message he was trying to give me on that horrible morning that I took him to the vet. I can only hope that he believed that I was doing what was the right thing for him. I hope that he loved that I took his ashes out on the sailboat that he and I loved to ride on together and spread his ashes out on the island we loved to walk on together. He really was a magic cat. And I still grieve for him so very much all these many years later. But I have to tell you that at the time Merlin died, I worked for a wonderful company. A company that when Merlin died, gave me 3 days of funeral leave, just as if a human family member had died. And people brought food and did things for me when my cat died. And that's the way I think we ought to do things, but that's just me. I tell you about my parents and my cat because that's one of my main points this morning. Grief simply is. Grief is grief is grief. There is no rule about how we grieve. One loss is not greater than or less than another, except the loss of a child. Losing a child is a whole different conversation. There is no time when grief ends. It gets easier, you manage, but there is never a time when there is not a part of us that we don't carry with us, that grief and that love for who's gone. Grief really does become a companion in many ways. And I believe, as Paula pointed out, that all of us carry with us many different kinds of grief in our lives. We grieve the loss of people, two-legged, four-legged, winged, swimming, crawling people. But we grieve more than losing the people we love. We grieve the what might have beens, the what ifs, the woulda, shoulda, couldas. We grieve the choices we've made or not. We grieve relationships and friendships that are lost. We grieve the loss of home and place. And I'm going to talk a lot about that in a few minutes. And even in the midst of joy, we sometimes grieve. I know when I retired, I was happy. That was done. But I also grieved. I loved my job. I loved what I did. So sometimes grief and sadness go together with extreme joy. And there's a connection there that's important for us to remember. We often grieve in anticipation of loss, when someone is dying, and we know that, or when there's some kind of a prolonged illness. We grieve knowing that something is coming. And the process for anticipatory grief is the same as grieving after loss has occurred. So a lot of times we have double layers of grief. We have grief in advance of an event, and then we start all over again after the fact. So the term for people who study and research and write about grief is thanatologist. So thanatologists have a myriad, of course, of theories about grief. And probably one of the best known thanatologists is a woman whose name was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And she was very active and very involved in grief theory, particularly during the height of the HIV and AIDS epidemic. And most of you, I heard some nods, but many of us know the Kubler-Ross model, those 5 stages of grief: denial, bargaining, anger, sadness, and acceptance. And over time, we societally came to think of those steps or stages, as Kubler-Ross called them, as sequential. And they're not. And Kubler-Ross actually never said they were. Those steps, denial, bargaining, despair, anger, and acceptance, roll all over each other. And they spin and spin around each other in lots of different ways. I have a visual image of what grief looks like. I don't know if they still make these, but most of you may know what I'm talking about. There used to be a Fisher-Price toy that was a piece of wood. It's probably plastic now, but it was a piece of wood, and it had those colored wires all over it, and then there were colored beads. Some of you know about these. Your grandchildren probably have them, right? Okay, that's what grief looks like. So sometimes when we're grieving, we take the the blue bead of depression, and we roll it around the wires for a while, and we focus on that for a bit, and then we think, no, wait, this can't be real. So then we take the yellow bead of denial, and we roll it around for a while. And then sometimes we roll 2 or 3 beads around at the same time. And sometimes we use a particular bead to mask another. For example, in my culture, it's not ladylike to be angry. And particularly about grief, that's not okay. So you roll the bead around the red bead of anger, but you roll the bead of sadness over it to mask it. And so we do that a lot. We mask one emotion with another. And then what happens is that we do that for a long time. And it's exhausting. Grief is hard work. And to make matters worse, sometimes we grieve more than one loss at a time. That's called compounded grieving. And so I think a lot of us live in compounded grieving. There's no sequential process sometimes to grief. We have more than one loss at a time, and they all sort of pile on top of each other. And not only do we grieve our own personal losses on top of each other, but we also grieve universal losses. I certainly cannot read the news today without grieving about so much. I think a lot of us do. And I could talk a lot about that today, and I'm not going to, because I could go down that rabbit hole for hours. But I will say this, that part of my daily routine is to light a candle in my house every day that burns. I use those white ones over there. That burns for people I'm praying for and for losses and grief that I know is going on in the world. And that in some way helps me to remember that I too am connected to that notion of universal loss. We also grieve, I mentioned this a minute ago, a loss of home, a loss of place. Recently, there's been a new term coined that describes that. It's called eco-grief. And eco-grief comes to us from an Australian, I love this is this man's job, an Australian environmental philosopher. Isn't that a great name? I want to be that. An environmental philosopher whose name is Glenn Albright. And he coined the term solastalgia. And here's the definition of solastalgia. It is emotional distress one feels when one's home landscape becomes unrecognizable through environmental change. There's another way to say that, and Jimmy Buffett did it well. How can you tell how it used to be when there's nothing left to see? So when I drive down Highway 17, and I smell pine sap from 50 acres of felled pine trees. I gag and I grieve. Last week I watched homeowners who just bought a house in my neighborhood rip out everything on a piece of property that the people who had lived there before had planted and done beautiful work with, and they cleared it all. So to lose home is to lose one's sense of self, one's place of being in the world, and that is grief. My Lakota teachers, who I had an opportunity to study with for a long time, have a wonderful sentence, and I promised them that every time I had an opportunity to share this with people, I would. And the sentence is Matakiasi. It's not spelled like it sounds at all, Matakiasi. And it translates, we are all related. And if we can look at that concept, that we are all related, then we become what we think of as the great gift-giving circle. And that not only that what we give and share and help with people who are grieving spreads out to them, but it spins on to other people, and it also comes back to us. So being a friend to someone who is grieving really truly exemplifies that notion of being related, of the great giving circle. When we truly sit with someone else's grief, we become a part of that ever-widening circle. While we can really never know how somebody else feels, we can be present, even if we just sit in silence. Grief is a process, it's a journey. And to walk with someone down the path of grief is to be truly present with someone in very deep connection that ripples forth in so many ways. My daddy died at about 2 in the morning. And around 7, I thought it was an okay hour to call somebody. So I called my friend Terry Lynn. Remember Terry Lynn and the chicken? And she knew when the phone rang at 7 o'clock in the morning why I was calling. And she didn't say hello when she picked up the phone. She said, "Where are you?" And I told her that Daddy had died, and I'd just left the hospital, and I was going to my parents' house. Her response to that was, "I'm cooking butter beans." And she hung up the phone. And I knew that Terry Lynn wasn't just cooking butter beans. I knew that Terry Lynn was packing a bag. I knew she was coming, and she was going to stay until I didn't need her there anymore. She was going to handle the kitchen. She was going to make sure that things got checked in so I could write thank you notes later. She was going to arrange flowers. She was going to do all those things that somebody who can think when you can't because you're grieving do. I'm cooking butter beans meant a whole lot more than butter beans. And so late at night, during those few nights, as after the people had left and the house got quiet, we would just sit and talk. She just sat with me. And so after Daddy was gone and buried, and I had time to reflect and go through all of the list of people who did so much, it was time to work on that thank you note. And the thank you note became a book. And the book became a guide for a lot of people, I'm told. And I don't think the book I wrote helps us navigate our own grief so much as it helps us to know what to say or do or not say or do when we have a friend who needs us. So I want to offer some suggestions to you. My mama loved Elvis. Mama loved her some Elvis. And she wanted Elvis played at her funeral. Well, fortunately, Elvis did a lot of gospel music. That was very helpful in my mom's church. So we were able to play Mama some Elvis. What's important about Mama wanting Elvis is that she wrote it down. She wrote those instructions down in advance directives. She and Daddy gave me lots of wonderful gifts. Oh my God. But the greatest gift they gave me was advance directives, so that my sister and I knew exactly what they did or did not want in preparation for dying, and then after they died. And we had committed to honoring exactly what they wanted, and we did, right down to Elvis. So I beg you, do advance directives. You can get the forms online, you can get them from your local hospice organization. I don't know, the hospital and the doctor's office may have them. So anyway, you get those forms. And make sure everybody, I mean everybody you know, has a copy. Keep a copy in your glove compartment. Be sure you have everything written down, because that is such a gift to your family. And you can even include comfort stuff. It's not just all the formal medical stuff. For example, in my advance directives it says, rub patchouli oil under my nose and play me the Grateful Dead. Why is that fun? Second, pay attention. Pay attention to friends who may be grieving about losses in ways you had not conceptualized. For example, when a friend moves, even by choice, there still may be a grieving process that's happening for what was left behind. Keep death dates in your calendar the same way you keep birth dates in your calendar. My lovely friend Dick Bates died some years ago near Memorial Day. And the year after he died, I called his son, who has been one of my best friends since the 3rd grade. I called John and I said, John, I'm just thinking about your daddy today. And I had not written it in my calendar, I just knew it was near Memorial Day. And John said to me, I wish you'd called yesterday. Yesterday was the anniversary of Dad's death. I keep death dates in my calendar. I said, offer you that option too. One of the best things I did for myself after the death of each of my parents and after Merlin was I put myself in counseling. I went to see a mental health professional who was trained in grief work, because I needed somebody without an emotional connection to the situation to help me process all the emotions I was feeling. So I feel like that really was one of the best things I did. Then the last thing I can suggest to you is that you really just listen, that you stay present with people that you love and care about and who are grieving. And so I want to close with this, that here we are on Pentecost, a day when Jesus' followers were confused and scared and angry and sad and all sorts of emotions, that they were feeling the same grief that many of us feel today or have felt or know someone who has felt along the way. And I invite you to remember this, that the word penta, prefix in that word, comes from the Greek. It means 5. And there are many ways of looking at the notion of 5. In numerology, it's often considered a number of chaos and confusion. But it is also a number of balance, of mind, body, spirit, of fire, air, earth, water, and spirit. And when you can keep that in mind, I think that it is often helpful when you have that awareness of the grieving process. So thank you all so very much for that. What I'd like to invite you to do now, where's my guy? Thank you. So what I'd like to invite us to do now is to just spend a few minutes in quiet meditation. You may just go into place for us and close your eyes. It's comfortable for you to do so. Take some long, slow, deep breaths. And let's just process what we've been talking about. So take a deep breath. And breathe in what you've been doing and thinking about. And when it's comfortable for you to do so, open your eyes and come back into the room. Thank you all so very much.
Dare to be yourself. Paint that independent street. Live the life you desire. Chase after your dreams. You're into nature. Sing harmony with the stars. With spirit as your compass, you always know where you are. Your smile is the medicine that can heal a broken heart. Your tears have shown me what it means to truly be strong. Your love is like the comfort of a mother's loving arms. Your life is a melody, and I've been singing along. Your smile is the medicine that can heal a broken heart. Your tears have shown me what it means to truly be strong. Your love is like the comfort of a mother's loving arms. Your life is a melody.